Hi, I'm Dan Q, and you're listening to a podcast that nobody asked for, exclusively about things that only I find interesting. Today I'll be talking about that time I got stuck in a lift with my friend Fiona. As usual, there's a blog post to accompany this episode. Today you'll find it at danq.link/stuck. Stuck in a lift. I was a small child the first time I got stuck in an elevator. I was always excited by lifts and by the opportunity for button pushing that they provided. I was absolutely obsessed with button pushing as a child, so much so that there aren't as many pictures of me as there might have been otherwise, because I always wanted to be the one to press the shutter release button on the camera. As a result, there's lots of blurry photos of me rushing towards the camera or being too close to focus on. In any case, I had run ahead of my mother to get into a lift, at which point the doors closed behind me. And for some reason, the call button on the outside didn't work, and I wasn't tall enough to reach the open doors button on the inside, so I was trapped in the elevator until it was called from another floor. Now, that time I got stuck in a lift as a small child is probably the only time that I've been stuck in a lift as a result of my own incapability, not being tall enough to reach the buttons. But my most memorable occasion of getting stuck in a lift was without a doubt a result of my own stupidity. Let's talk about how to break a lift, and I mean that in both spellings of the word. You see, it turns out that in some lifts, the emergency brakes are sensitive enough that even a little bit of a bounce can cause them to engage, and once they're locked on, the lift won't move at all until the brakes are manually released by an engineer, as I discovered back in March 2004. You see, contrary to what TV and movies will teach you, it's actually incredibly difficult to make a lift drop down its shaft. Anyway, back in March 2004, on behalf of Three Rings, a non-profit that I founded, I was speaking at the Nightline Association conference. While there, I'd bumped into my friend Fiona, who was also in attendance. I'd met Fiona on a bulletin board a couple of years earlier when she volunteered to help test Three Rings. She later visited me in Aberystwyth, where she and my friend Kit, who was also helping with the project in those days, fell in love. It was very sweet. Anyway, this conference was taking place on the upper floor of the Manchester University Students' Union building, and as the pair of us got into the lift down to the ground floor, I noticed something strange. "Whoa," I said. "This lift is really spongy, isn't it?" I asked, noticing how much the cabin seemed to bounce and sag as we stepped into it. "Oh yeah," said Fiona, whose strong Scottish accent I'm not going to attempt, shifting her weight to give it an experimental jiggle. The elevator started to descend, and as it did so, we both gave it another gentle bump, mostly, in my case at least, with an experimental mindset. Did it wobble that much only when it was stopped at a floor, or did it do it all the time? It turns out it did it all the time, except when we bounced it between the floors, as we were now, the emergency brakes detected this as a problem and locked on. The lift jerked to an immediate halt. We were stuck. I think I was reminded of this anecdote because the other night I had a dream about it, which in turn was probably inspired by a story that my partner Ruth told me about her recent experience of using a smart lift, one with basically no functional buttons on the inside. You scan your room key for the hotel that you were in at the lobby for the lifts, and then it calls the lift and tells you which one to get in, and it takes you to the right place. Anyway, Fiona and I shouted for help from people on a nearby floor, and they were able to summon assistance and get the lift maintenance company called. Unfortunately, we were told, because it was a weekend, we'd likely have to wait for up to 4 hours before anyone could come to get us, so we'd need to amuse ourselves in the meantime. I learned 2 things about Fiona that day. The first thing I learned very soon after this moment, and that was that she's mildly claustrophobic. Not enough to stop her from going in a lift, but enough that if she knows she can't get out of a lift, it might cause her a problem. And so I figured, I need a way to distract her from the situation, so I suggested we should play a game. "How about I Spy?" I said, half jokingly, knowing that game surely could not occupy us for very long within the confines of a small metal box. "Sure," she agreed. "You go first." "I spy with my little eye something beginning with N," I said. If we were going to be stuck in here playing I Spy for several hours, I might as well pick something deviously tricky. Embedded into the corners of the floor were these 4 recessed hexagonal nuts, so my word was nut. That'd keep her occupied for a while. I don't remember exactly what she guessed and when, but eventually she got it right. It probably took less than 5 minutes. Now it was her turn. Fiona thought for a little while, looking around our tiny prison. Eventually she found something. "I spy with my little eye," she said, and then after a pause, "something beginning with S." "Screw?" I asked, immediately assuming that she'd have chosen something as devious as I thought mine was, and noticing that the button panel had these 4 flathead screws holding it in place. "Nope," she indicated. Shoes. Soles," I suggested, pointing to the bottoms of my shoes, which were visible as I was sitting on the floor of the lift. "Nope." Shirt? Socks. I was glancing at myself. I wasn't sure there was much inside the lift that wasn't me or Fiona, so it seemed likely the thing I was looking for was on or part of one of us. "Step," I gambled, indicating the metal strip that ran under the closed doors. No luck. Shaft. Can you see part of the lift shaft somehow? A smirk and an eye roll. I was getting further from the right answer. It turns out there's not much to I Spy in a stopped elevator. I briefly thought there might be a number, like a floor number, 6 or 7, but the building we were in didn't have that many floors. Sliding doors. Slit. Slot. Still nothing. This continued, and you'll be glad to hear I'm going to spare you all of this, for 3 hours. I'd love to say those 3 hours flew by, but they didn't. It was still infinitely preferable to being stuck in there alone, and indeed being stuck in there alone would have been preferable to spending 3 or 4 hours stuck in a lift with some people, but it didn't pass quickly. Fiona sat, self-satisfied, smugly enjoying my increasing frustration right up until the point at which a lift engineer arrived and began levering open the doors on one of the 2 floors that we were wedged between in order to allow us to wriggle our way out. I must have inspected every square centimetre of that tiny space, and of myself, and of my gaming companion. Clearly, I was alongside the world grandmaster of I Spy, and I hadn't even known it. "Okay, I give up," I said at last. "What the hell was it?" And this is about the point when I would make the second of the 2 discoveries I made about Fiona that day. I discovered that she's profoundly dyslexic. "Circle," she said, pointing at the lit ring around the alarm button, which we'd pressed some hours before. Circle. Circle is something beginning with S that I attempted to guess for 3 hours. I don't think it's possible for a person to spontaneously explode, because if it were, I would have done so that day. Fiona got stuck in a lift again that spring, 2 months later. That's got to be statistically unlikely, right? But I'd like to think that it was karma. Once again, this episode was based on a blog post, which you can find at danq.link/stuck. If you enjoyed today's episode, leave a comment there or drop me an email on podcast@danq.me. I'm always delighted to hear from my listener. Yes, I mean you, Matt. Dan Q for listening. Dan Q very much.